Okay, time to do this. I'm woefully behind in recording these, so I'm gonna start making that up today. Fortunately, I have a lecture to prepare for Tuesday. Thursday, I plan to give the class their final, or their midterm, I guess, and then they go on spring break for a week, which should give me ample time to catch up. Looking at my notes here, I believe this is 7. I've already recorded 8. I have 9, 11, and 12 to record, so I have 4. I'm 4 behind presently. So I'll get this one done today. This one kind of encompasses 2 lectures that I did, one of which was one that I provided to them, and then another one that we ran through in class. So kind of gonna just start charting along through it. So over to the slides, which I believe are here. Sweet. Okay. So today we're going to start talking about cross-site scripting. If you look at the one that I recorded, which I put up already, which was 8, it already have an idea of where we're going to go. But there's some beginning stuff that happens here. When I gave this in class, because we kind of ran out of time, I don't think I need to go through it in the lecture here because I did do it when we went through the lecture. I have some whiteboard components that I haven't yet figured out how I'm going to handle. We're just gonna have to work it out, I think, honestly, because I don't know how to reasonably do the whiteboard component of it. I might have to open a browser window with Lucid, which means I'll probably have to change out the capture source that I'm doing for some of this stuff. So we're just gonna have to figure it out here, and we'll probably have to bump along as I go through it. But let's get started. In class, I kind of went through the session hijacking redo. I'm not going to do it here just for time because it's already going to be a long video. It's already going to accompany 2 things that we went through here. Cool. So we move on to cross-site scripting. So what is cross-site scripting, right? Like, what do we care about here, right? Like, cross-site scripting, in the end, it's a trust failure, right? It maps to, I guess I should have my notes here to see. Yeah, no, okay, we're good. It maps to CWE, Common Web Enumeration, or Common Weakness Enumeration 79, and it is in the OWASP top 10. So cross-site scripting is a methodology where the attacker attempts to get the victim's browser to do something that it wasn't intended to do. In almost every case, this is to run some sort of JavaScript code, right? Hence where the scripting piece of cross-site scripting comes from. And it's basically abusing trust, right? It's the browser is overly trusting of the user input, and the server is, or the browser is rendering user input. It's trusting server output, and the backend server is trusting user input. At least in the 2 types we'll talk about today. In the video that I've already recorded, session 8, I talked about DOM-based, which is entirely client-side trust violation. So, when an attacker or somebody is attempting to do cross-site scripting, there's a handful of things they can actually be doing, right? The first is session theft, right? Like, I talked about session theft in lesson 6 and a couple of the others. The reality of it is session theft in the traditional standpoint is largely not something that you really see in the wild that much these days, right? Like almost everything is TLS. It's, you're going to get browser warnings if you're in the middle of it, right? So except in certain circumstances, it's actually pretty uncommon for somebody to steal your session, directly from like man in the middling it, with the exception of something like EvilGenix, where we're running a reverse proxy. Traditional session hijacking is something that I don't see in the wild as much anymore. But what you do see is, a couple of other things, where people might steal your session cookie out of your browser history. If they get a hold of your browser, right, they might steal it or out of your cookie jar. But more commonly, you start seeing them, trying to steal it via session theft via cross-site scripting, where you just post it away. There are related things such as credential harvesting you see, where you're, reading the post that they're doing and posting it elsewhere, clickjacking. And this can pivot to cross-site request forgery, which is something that we're going to cover here in a little bit. So there are three types of, well, there are more than three types. There are three types of cross-site scripting that I'm going to cover here, and then a bunch of ancillary types that aren't really all that covered that happen here. Right, the first is stored, which is the worst type. We'll talk about it in a moment. The second is reflected, right? Which is less bad. Basically means that you send input to the page, it's immediately reflected back out. It's probably the most common one. It's also generally probably the least useful one. And then the third one is DOM based, which is covered in lesson 8, which is already up and online. Today we're going to talk about the first two. So the worst of them is stored cross-site scripting, right? This happens when the payload is stored server side. The reason it's the worst is typically that means it can be delivered to many users. Not in every case, but it can be delivered to multiple users, or it can be delivered more than once because it got stored in the backend database. Right? This is oftentimes tied to something like a comment, profile, message, chat box, right? Like some sort of thing that is persisted in the back end. You see it in profiles. I actually had a type like the log4j token that was kind of related but not really. I had that in my LinkedIn profile for a while just to see if it would fire, right? But like this is a relatively common methodology, and basically what it is you have a browser that takes user input, and the browser then stores that user input, but it doesn't do any sort of sanitation, right? So as you can see down here in the blue, the user does something like this. Whoops, where they're just gonna put a script tag in there, right? And maybe they're gonna script alert document.cookie. It is worth noting as I go through these exercises here that I am giving you the absolutely simplest examples that you can go through for these sorts of things, right? Like the real world use cases, you're not just gonna alert document.cookie. This is basically the alert method of doing this is hello world of cross-site scripting, right? Like you tend to see it used for demonstrations and to prove that it actually exists. It's if you see a proof of concept come in or some sort of web application vulnerability tester, they're almost certainly going to give you an example that uses alert, but just bear in mind that alert is a benign thing you can do with this. The real world payloads are a lot more complicated. They're going to do things like post data elsewhere, right? They're going to do things that steal it. They might do things that make your browser do things that it otherwise you weren't intending for it to do, right? Like, but the crux of it is that you put stuff inside of a comment that is rendered directly in the browser, right? HTML tags and all. So from an architectural view of what happens here, right, the user submits some sort of content, right, the server doesn't sanitize the content properly, it stores it, the user comes back later and re-renders a page, and that content is brought back out and placed directly into the HTML page without any sort of sanitation. And then because of that, the browser runs it as HTML, right? So if there are script tags in there, it will run the inline scripts, and that is essentially what you get when you're doing a stored cross-site scripting, right? Like from a high-level perspective, you'll see it. We'll go through it here in DVWA in a couple minutes, and hopefully once we do that, it'll make a lot more sense. But the high-level thing there is to know user submits content, server, and server is very important here because that's what makes it stored. Server doesn't sanitize it, stores it, echoes it back later. We are going to contrast that with reflected, right? Like, so a reflected cross-site scripting is it's exactly that, right? Like you basically, the user sends some sort of data in, that data is immediately echoed back out into the page without any sort of validation, right? Like and it comes back, right? Like this is really commonly the case. I think it's most often the case with search results, right? You type something into the search box, the thing helpfully spits it back out to you, and without any sort of sanitation, and you end up running HTML there. You do see it in things like name fields and stuff like that, but typically those sorts of things are stored, right? And that's I think the big difference there is that Search fields have the notable thing of not typically being stored, right? They're typically, you'd get the search results and it's just going to echo back out what you searched for on the page to show you searched for blah, right? Like other place you might see this error messages, right? If you cause some sort of error, it may be like, hey, thing you entered is invalid input. Well, that thing could be JavaScript, right? It could do other things and then debug output, right? So like these are things where the backend server is taking action on the user input, but it's not storing it in any sort of database. It's just echoing it directly back out to the user, usually for the user's convenience, right? And that's how it differs from stored, right? It is generally, it's just not stored, right? Like that's there's nothing really more to say about it, is the fact that you're not storing it. This generally isn't as bad as stored, just because it's a little bit less limited utility, right? Like it requires direct user interaction with the page to get them to do the thing, then to get it to echo back out, right? Like, so you tend to use it with things like links they might click on that have URL parameters in it that go to search pages, things like that. But it's more the case that a reflected cross-site scripting is something that you basically have to convince the user to do for it to be useful, right? It's not directly, it's not something that you can store and then the user can come back later, right? Like you need to convince the user to take some sort of action. So we have our little handy-dandy table here that we're gonna talk about, right? Like a stored cross-site scripting has high persistence, right? Like, or it has persistence, whereas reflected doesn't, right? Stored is delivery is automatic, as it can be, right? You go to the page, the stored value is pulled back, right? Whereas delivery for a reflected one has to be social. You have to get the user to do something that's going to do it, right? And then typically stored ones are bad because the impact can be broad, right? Like especially if it's some sort of like forum message displayed to a lot of users, you can cause them to do something, or say it's in like a blog comment system or any sort of thing like that, right? Those tend to be delivered to a lot of users and not just your user. Whereas a reflected cross-site scripting attack is almost always limited to the user that actually submitted the data, right? Because there's no persistence, and HTTP is stateless, as we've talked about many, many, many times. So you can't really do much with it there. So how do we stop this? Well, we sanitize, right? Like it's sanitize, right? Like in a pro tip here, like generally I feel like it's the case that you probably shouldn't be trying to self-sanitize your data, right? Like there are various libraries. Let me look one up here. DOM Purify, that's the one I was thinking of. DOM Purify is probably the most common example of ones I see used, right? Like you typically want to use something like that, right? Or some sort of sanitization system that you probably didn't write yourself, right? This is the case where writing it yourself is likely to make all the mistakes that every single person that ever wrote this before you have made, right? Like you're probably not going to get it right, right? So use some sort of library to try to protect against this. And just make sure you properly URL escape or do whatever you need to do to the data to make sure that they're not doing naughty things. But, it's brittle, right? Like the reason I suggested that we use something like DOM Purify, right, is that blacklists are really brittle, and there are so many cases where somebody thinks they've stopped something for either injection or cross-site scripting, and then you start playing with things like Unicode, and they're actually still quite vulnerable, right? Like they're still a thing. You can still cause those same problems. You just have to do it a little more creatively, right? And then when you encode, context can matter, right? There are definitely places where you don't want to, where you need to leave some of those elements in place, right? Like if you have a forum where the users can submit HTML and it's expected, right? If you just strip out all HTML, you break that, right? So now you need to stop just script, but what happens if I put comments in the middle of it, right? It's like really naive to just start searching for individual characters and trying to do it. But the other big thing is that parsing differs, right? Like the way that the server parses the data can be very different than the way that the client does, especially with things like Unicode. right? Like a lot of these systems running like Linux on the back end may not natively do Unicode, or they may not be configured to do Unicode, right? Like they may just treat it like data, so they're not gonna pull that down to its underlying character, for instance, right? And then the question I asked the class is, why doesn't just replacing less than fix this, right? In theory, that should fix it, right? Because less than starts script blocks. But again, back to what I said earlier, well, there are valid uses of the less than, right? Like we probably don't just want to replace it. There are also methodologies where, maybe I put a link in there that's a JavaScript, it's just a JavaScript URL type, right? Like JavaScript : and then just alert, right? Like, and then you just you have a link that does some sort of cross-site scripting, right? So it's really naive to think that you can just strip out the /script tag and solve all of these problems. It just doesn't work in practice. So cross-site scripting can lead, right? It can lead to session hijacking, right? Like the cross-site script reads the JavaScript cookies, or executes JavaScript that reads the cookies from the site, and then we end up posting the session cookie off-site, right? And then we can use that session cookie later, the attacker at their convenience, assuming it's still valid to do naughty things with it, right? And that's actually a really common use case for this, and it's a really common attack that we see. So we have a good amount more in-depth stuff that we talk about later. Actually just covered it Thursday with a class. So, we're a couple behind, but I'll get to it in the next week or so. We can use output encoding. That doesn't allow scripts, like basically just URL encode those elements that are sensitive in HTML. That can work, right? Some sort of context-aware scripting, so that we're stripping out just the pieces that matter, right? I again recommend, if you're doing this, you use something like DOM Purify that is good at it and is maintained by more than just you. We can use HTTP-only cookies. What is that, you ask? Well, HTTP-only is a security flag that allows the cookie to only be read or only be sent via HTTP. It means it so you can't actually read the cookie via JavaScript, right? That's probably the most common methodology used to stop this. You just can't read the session cookie from JavaScript then. That doesn't work, obviously, if you need to, right? If you have valid reasons to read the session cookie there, then it's not going to work very well if you try to do that. And then the last thing is the content security policy, which is something we covered Thursday and we'll cover later. So for the class, right, like I indicated to them I was going to be out of town. I ended up recording that DOM-based XSS for them because of that, right? So, and then I went away from there, from that. Let me double check my notes here just so I can see, I think day 9. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to stop this one here because day 9, my notes say it's 7B, right? It's basically the one that I did that showed all of the different types of cross-site scripting, and we did a demo of it. So I'll leave this, albeit pretty short video that I'm about to put up, as an independent video, and then the next one will have a very short slide deck. I think it's only let me see here, it's like 15 slides. But it's a lot of demo and a lot of whiteboard. It's going to take me a little bit of time, and I'll probably want to record that one at the office, so I'll probably wait and do it tomorrow. But I'll get that one up and recorded in the next day or so. And then again, there was no day 10, so you'll get 9, 11, and 12 out of me over the next few days. But anyways, if you're keeping up on there, right, like I do have some extra CTF challenges up. I am about to put the source code for those up, so if you wanted to run them locally, you'd be able to. Yeah, that's it. I'll talk to you later.